Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about Barrett esophagus. I've drawn the esophagus here along with the stomach and the duodenum, and as you can see here, the red squiggly line that I've drawn is the squamocolumnar junction. So I want you guys to know that the esophagus, it's lined by non-keratinizing stratified squamous epithelium, okay, and the stomach is lined by columnar epithelium, okay, columnar cells. And the squamocolumnar junction is essentially, where the esophagus meets the stomach. So I actually drew it a little bit higher here. It would actually be like maybe around here. But I'm just doing this for visual purposes. But just so you guys understand the concept, the squamocolumnar junction is essentially where the cells change from squamous to columnar. And why is that happening? It's because we're going from the esophagus to the stomach, and these two organs are just lined by different types of cells, okay? Now, we're going to talk about something called metaplasia, okay? Metaplasia. What happens in metaplasia and why does it happen? So, metaplasia is the transformation of one cell type to another, okay? And this usually happens because your body tries to adapt to some type of stress, okay? And let's just use an example here. Let's say someone has some acid reflux, okay? So what happens in acid reflux? The gastric acid just, basically shoots up from the stomach into the lower portion of the esophagus, okay? And your body tries to, react to this because the cells of the esophagus aren't fit to handle the acid that shoots up, okay? So what the cells in the esophagus, they undergo metaplasia to columnar cells, okay? So the acid essentially makes the lower portion of the esophagus, those squamous cells, change into columnar cells because the columnar cells are better adapted to acid. They're better at dealing with the acid, okay? And your body does this to, essentially try and protect yourself, okay? So that's essentially the whole concept of Barrett esophagus. And something important to know is that Barrett esophagus actually increases your risk of esophageal adenocarcinoma. Esophageal adenocarcinoma. And the reason for this is because we're undergoing metaplasia. And if you undergo metaplasia, that can eventually lead to dysplasia. If metaplasia is prolonged and if dysplasia is long lasting, then that can eventually turn into carcinoma. And that's essentially why Barrett esophagus can lead to esophageal adenocarcinoma. And the esophageal adenocarcinoma is particularly only in the lower one third of the esophagus, okay? Now, let's take a look here at a real esophagus. So this is an endoscopy. So essentially the physician is just putting a tube down the patient's throat, and it has a camera on it. So we're looking basically down into the patient's esophagus. And if you look closely on this image, this area here, that opening is basically the opening to the stomach. So down there, that's basically where the squamocolumnar junction normally should be, okay? So all this pale area that you're seeing here, like all this pale, like outside this big circle that I just drew, all that pale pinkish area, that is how the normal epithelium of the esophagus should look. And if you recall earlier, I said that the esophagus is lined by non-keratinizing stratified squamous epithelium, okay? And what happens in Barrett esophagus is that the non-keratinizing stratified squamous epithelium transforms into columnar epithelium with goblet cells, non-ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells, okay? And goblet cells essentially just secrete mucus, okay? And I'll show you guys how this looks on a microscope as well, so we can really nail the concept down, okay? So what you're seeing here is essentially all this red area, like basically inside this big circle that I just drew, this whole red area, those are, that's basically the normal gastric mucosa, okay? That's basically how your stomach looks. And this is like, we can tell that this is Barrett esophagus because we can see that this red it's coming up, like it's coming up out of this like the squamocolumnar junction is essentially moving up here. So all these columnar cells, like all these epithelial cells, underwent metaplasia to columnar cells, and this is essentially how it looks like on an endoscopy. We'll basically just see, the gastric mucosa like rising up the esophagus slowly. And the reason for that, once again, is due to the metaplasia of the esophageal cells, okay? And once again, they go from non-keratinizing stratified squamous epithelium into non-ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells, okay? Now, let's take a look at it on a microscope, okay? So, on the left side here, we can see this whole area. This is basically how the normal esophagus looks on a microscope, okay? So this is stratified squamous epithelium. Now, if you take a look to the right here, we can see that these cells, they're starting to look more columnar now. They're starting to look more columnar, and there's a clear distinction here. And over here, we see these big white cystic kind of spaces, and what those are goblet cells. And recall that fat doesn't stain well unless if you use the proper stain under the microscope, and it usually just becomes clear under the microscope, and we call that an artifact of the preparation, okay? And over here, essentially, we can see that the normal stratified squamous epithelium over here is getting transformed into this columnar epithelium with goblet cells. So if you look above, like this outline that I'm drawing here, if you just look above that line, we can see all these little columnar cells, kind of like a, column shape, rectangle shape, whatever you want to call it, and these goblet cells, okay, goblet cells. Well, there's one here, there's one here, there's one here. We see all these goblet cells, okay? So that's essentially what happens in Barrett esophagus. And if you guys have any questions, let me know. But I really hit the high yield points there. So, just to recap, Barrett esophagus is essentially when the lower 1/3 of the esophagus tries to adapt to the body's gastric acid reflux. And it usually happens in gastric acid, gastroesophageal reflux disease, And what happens is that this esophageal cells undergo metaplasia from non-keratinizing stratified squamous epithelium to non-ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells, okay? And the reason that happens is because they're better suited to deal with the acid reflux, okay? And another thing that's important to know is that Barrett esophagus can eventually lead to dysplasia, which increases your risk for esophageal adenocarcinoma. And another very important thing to note is that the esophageal adenocarcinoma primarily affects the lower 1/3 of the esophagus, okay? All right, I'll see you guys in the next one.